It was New Year's Day, or New Year's night really. Priya, the girls and I are driving along the road. We've just crossed the Great Western Highway heading down towards Eastern Creek Raceway. And as we're driving down, a really fast car zips past us. And as he zips past us, a kangaroo jumps out on the road in front of him. He hits the kangaroo and he keeps going. He drives over the kangaroo's back foot. And so we end up on the road and we are looking at this kangaroo. It's desperately trying to crawl off the road, confused because its foot doesn't work. It can't stand up. It's in agony. And as it's wriggling around there, at one moment, it's like it turns and looks me straight in the eye. And I can see the fear, the confusion and pain in that kangaroo's eye. And we can't do anything practically to help it. We did call wires. Kangaroos have razor-sharp claws. You don't want to get close to a frantic one. But that moment, I was wondering, as we kept driving home, why? Why did it play out like that? Half a second more and the kangaroo would have dodged the car. Half a second less, it would have been a clean kill. But the way it was led to this animal being in agony and terror. And it seemed unfair and it seemed evil. I tell you that story because in a small way it illustrates the problem of evil. The problem of evil is that terrible things happen, but we can't always see why. Why did that terrible thing happen? So, for example, why are there so many wars? Why can't there be peace? Why so many earthquakes, fires and floods? Why was Charlie Kirk assassinated? Why are so many politicians corrupt? Why do some mothers suffer miscarriages and infertility while others do not? Why did the Bondi Massacre happen? Why is food, water and shelter so expensive? Now, it's not that we don't know anything at all about why these things happen. There are observations we can make about causes to some extent, but it's not clear why some people suffer these things more than others. And sometimes we struggle to see God working for good in the midst of these great evils. And as we live in this world, we will keep seeing and hearing great evil on the news. We will keep experiencing evil in our lives and the lives of people we love. And we need to ask the question, what hope does God hold out to us as we face these things? And surprisingly, at the end of the Christmas story, there's a very dark moment. Barb just read it to us. I don't know if you realise that the Christmas story in Matthew finishes on such a dark note. We see incredibly dark evil in Herod. We also see hope. So the great evil happens right in the very middle of our passage, in verse 16. When it says, so in verse 16, the Magi, the wise men, have left Jesus. They've been to see Jesus. And King Herod, remember, King Herod is the king of Israel at this time. He's a very skillful and clever man. He has lots of successes as a king, but he's really a puppet king of the Roman Empire, and he's not Jewish by birth, so he doesn't have a rightful claim to the throne. Just days earlier, the wise men have visited him. They've said, "We're seeking the newborn king of the Jews to worship him." And Herod has said to the religious leaders, where's the Messiah supposed to be born? They say, Bethlehem. And then he said to the wise men, "Come and tell me exactly where he is so I can worship him too." But the wise men are warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. They take the scenic route home, and Herod eventually, maybe a few days later, works out they're not coming back. And he is furious. And this is bad because Herod is a brutal, violent, paranoid king. Herod is so paranoid that he had murdered several of his own sons in his paranoid desire to hold on to power. So the action he takes here is so in line with his paranoia and wickedness. He gives orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who are 2 years old and under. It's wicked. Bethlehem's not far from Jerusalem. It wouldn't have taken long for his troops to go out and do this. Jesus would have been somewhere between 6 months and two years old at this time. Herod is taking whatever measures he can to kill this rival to the throne. And the little town of Bethlehem at this point has about 1,500 residents. So that would have meant maybe 10 or 12 little boys killed and maybe 10 or 12 mothers absolutely devastated. Remember, the problem of evil is that terrible things happen, but it's not always clear why. And from a Christian perspective, I just want to tease out some questions we can ask as we see what happens in Matthew 2, as we wrestle with the problem of evil and what God is doing. Now, remember this. God led the wise men to Jesus by a star. He could have circumvented Jerusalem. He didn't have to lead them to Herod first. It's only because the wise men went to Herod that Herod knows there's a rival who's been born. Why did God let that happen? There's a question we can ask. God sends an angel to Joseph, Jesus' father, to warn him, Herod's trying to kill Jesus, get him out of here. Why didn't God send that angel to the other 10 or 12 fathers of those boys? Why didn't he? Herod dies of a terrible sickness not long after this. Why didn't God kill him before he did this wickedness instead of after it? Why does God allow Herod to do this wicked act? That's the problem of evil as it plays out in this. Why have these terrible things happened? And there are at least two ways we can ask a question like this. We could ask this as a skeptic. We could say, I'm not going to believe in an all-powerful God who lets the Herods of this world run riot. We could do that. But that would be dumb. Because if we do that, we're actually putting ourselves on a pedestal trying to stand in judgment on God. And God doesn't answer to us. We answer to him. We're the creatures. He's the creator. But you can also ask this question as a believer. You can say, I trust God. God, I trust you, but there's some questions I'd really love you to help me on. It's actually in faith, wrestling with the problem of evil. I'm encouraging us to do that today. And in case you're wondering, I don't have all the answers here. I'm not going to be able to plumb all the depths of this question. I just want to acknowledge that it's a real question that Christians wrestle with. And I do believe that Matthew chapter 2 gives us hope. Hope as we think about this question, as we get some insight into what God is doing in this world, even in the midst of great evil. And if you, as all of us are at some times, if you are a sufferer of evil wrestling with these questions, may the Lord comfort you today. Got 2 points. The first one is God's got a plan by zooming in. The second one is God's got a plan by zooming out. Let's start with God's got a plan by zooming in. This passage won't answer all our questions about the problem of evil, but it does show us that God has a plan to bring good even out of evil, even through evil. He knows all things. He's working his purposes out. So in verse 13, the start of our passage, when they had gone, that's the wise men, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. These are the things the angel tells Joseph. Get up. Take the child and his mother. He puts the child first because the child is the king. Escape to Egypt. There would have been a number of Israelites living in Egypt at that time, although it wouldn't have been an easy journey or an easy stay. And then he says, stay there until I tell you. Why? Because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. God knows exactly what's going on. He knows what Herod's doing. He deliberately gets Jesus out of Bethlehem. And by the way, for those of us who are here on Christmas Day we saw that Joseph is a very impressive man, didn't we? That when God tells him to do something, he does it to the letter. And he does that again here. What does Joseph do? He gets up. He takes the child and his mother. He goes to Egypt and he stays there until Herod dies. And we're told later that the reason he stays till Herod died is because the angel appears and tells him, go home. He does exactly what he's told by God's messenger. By the way, last week we saw this wouldn't have been an easy command for Joseph to carry out. It would have been expensive and difficult in lots of ways. But last week we saw the wise men give Jesus gifts of gold. they would have needed that gold for the trip to Egypt. God has provided the way. Verse 19, at the end of Herod's evil actions, after Herod dies, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. This is like a mirror of what's happened before. What he says is, get up, take the child and his mother, go to the land of Israel. Why? Because those who are trying to take the child's life are dead. It's a mirror commandment of what he'd told Joseph earlier. Now that Herod is dead, it's safe to go home. And Joseph once again obeys in every detail what he is told. But when we come to this second part of God's plan, there's more detail in God's plan here, because when Joseph gets home, Archelaus is ruling a certain part of Israel. So up here, we've got a map of Israel and surrounding areas. And after Herod dies, his kingdom is split up between 3 of his sons. And this green area is ruled by Archelaus, and he was a brutal, nasty guy like his dad. Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Judea is all in the Archelaus-ruled area. But that yellow part up the top there, Galilee, was ruled by Antipas, Herod Antipas. He was not as nasty as Archelaus. And so we're told that being warned in a dream, Joseph withdrew to the district of Galilee and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. If you know Luke's gospel, you know that Nazareth is Joseph's and probably Mary's hometown. And so they go and live in a safer place. God's got a plan to protect Jesus to grow up to be the saviour of the world. So God's got a plan, even in the midst of the evils of this world. But I just want to imagine with you for a moment the mothers of Bethlehem after Herod murders those boys. This is how these mothers are described. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And imagine if someone was to go into Bethlehem after Herod did what he did and was to say to those ladies, it's okay, it's all part of God's plan to save the world through Jesus. You'd get slapped if you did that. And rightly so. Because when someone faces devastating evil in their life, the first response has got to be to weep with them. Tears are the right response to an evil act like Herod's. I just want to acknowledge that. And, you know, when we face the problem of evil, having all the right answers isn't going to help people who are crying. Actually, putting your arm around them and crying with them is an appropriate thing. But at some point, we do need to think about what's going on. So maybe for these mothers, maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe years after the tragedy, these weeping women will need to answer a question: where is God in this? Where is God in this pain? And I put it to you today that the Bible's answer to that question is not easy, but it's livable. In fact, it's the only answer, I would say, that's livable. Now think about some other options other than the Bible's answer. What if the problem of evil is this: God is this lovely guy that would love to help with evil, but he just can't do it. He's not strong enough. And he weeps with people but can't do anything about it. Well, that's a pathetic God. That's a God who can't save. There's despair in that. If God is weak, there's no hope there. Or what if God is super powerful, but he just doesn't care enough to do anything about evil? That's a terrifying God, isn't it? These are some of the different ideas they put out. Or what about this? What if God is actually like this amazing clockmaker? So he makes the world, this lovely world, and then leaves it to function without him. Or what if there is no God, and actually the reason we exist is because just through evolutionary processes, slime plus time, there's no God, there's no design. Do you know what that means? That means survival of the fittest. And that's great for the fittest, but for the rest of us, that's unlivable. There's an American writer, Alvin Plantinga, And he says, evil cannot exist without God. He says, unless there is a right way that we are called on to live by an external authority, then we can't call anything wrong. He says, a secular way of looking at the world has no place for genuine moral responsibility of any sort. So if you think there is such a thing as horrifying wickedness and evil, then you have a powerful argument for the reality of God. Without God, love is meaningless, compassion is meaningless, grace is meaningless. Without divine design, kindness and compassion are just inventions that we've made to make life easier for us. See, all of these different alternatives, they don't give hope. They're not livable. But the Bible tells us about a God who does great good through evil. A God who enters into the evil of the world and works around that, works through that, that he will bring good. The ultimate way he does that is in the cross, when Jesus becomes human and enters the evil in the world in being killed for the sins of the world, and then rises to life. And through Jesus dying and rising again, he brings forgiveness, new life, wholeness and hope to those who trust in him. I've shared this picture with you a couple of times last year. It's called the J-curve. And it's the shape of Jesus' life. Jesus willingly went into suffering and then was glorified, and he invites us to see our hope, that there is suffering in this life, but there is glory in the life to come. And remember this, God only saved Jesus from Bethlehem for a little while, because later at the cross, the last baby boy in Bethlehem is hunted down and killed, so that by his death, he might save people like me and you. And when he comes back again, all evil will be undone. And you might say to me, okay, look, I get it. I get that God is going to bring an end to evil at some point. I get that he's going to do that through Jesus. He's already doing it through Jesus. I get it that when Jesus comes back, all tears will be wiped away. That's great. But why didn't Jesus come back before World War II happened and all those people were killed? Why didn't Jesus come back before Russia and Ukraine had their war? Why didn't Jesus come back before that terrible thing that happened to me, or that terrible thing happened to someone I love? Why doesn't Jesus show up and save everyone now? Why doesn't he end all evil now? And God's probably got a million answers to that question, some of which he's revealed in his word. Let me share two comments, and these two of the million. Here's one. If Jesus came back before World War II, for most of us, that would mean we would never have been born and would never have heard the gospel and would never have been saved. For some of us, if Jesus came back a year ago, we would never have heard the gospel and been saved. God's patience, even as great evils happen, means the good of more people being born, hearing the gospel and being saved. God is patiently waiting for more and more in that way. Here's one more. Let me take you back to that kangaroo. As that kangaroo tried to pull itself off the road and it looked straight in my eyes, it did something good in me. It moved me to grieve the presence of evil in the world, because this world is not our home. This world is full of wrongness and wickedness, but there's this constant pull from feel-good TV shows, different experiences, this constant pull to think this world is our home, this world is normal, this world is all there is. But every time something evil happens, it reminds us that we need Jesus to come back. It reminds us that this world is not all there is. It reminds us to pray, "Come, Lord Jesus, come." Two reasons out of the million. May God reveal more to us in time. So there's one encouragement. God's got a plan in the details of Matthew chapter 2. But I want to get to point 2 in a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to pray, because this is heavy stuff. I'm going to pray for us as we process this. Heavenly Father, what we've looked at so far in your word, it's hard, it's heavy. We've looked at a very dark moment in history, and I pray particularly for people here today, brothers and sisters here today, who are currently grieving evils that they are seeing in this world, in their own lives, in the lives of people they love. Please, would you give them the comfort and the strength they need to love Jesus and those around them through these challenges. Thank you that your word does reveal that you are a God who brings good out of evil, ultimately in the cross, but in all kinds of other ways as well. In some ways we find that hard. In some ways we'd rather you just didn't allow evil to happen. Help us with the things that we struggle with. Show us more of yourself. Show us more of your grace. Show us more of your love. Heal our wounds and strengthen our trust in you as we look forward to the day when Jesus returns and wipes all our tears away. Amen. I do briefly want to zoom out now. We've looked in at the details at Matthew 2. I want to zoom out now and think about God's plan on a wider lens. And I want to start by doing that by reading a poem to you. This is not from the Bible, but it's written by a Christian. My life is but a weaving between my Lord and I cannot choose the colours. He worketh steadily. Often he weaves sorrow, and I, in foolish pride, forget he sees the upper and I the underside. Shall God unfold the canvas and explain the reasons why? Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly. The dark threads are as needed in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver on the patterns he has planned. He knows, he loves, he cares. Nothing the truth can dim. He gives the very best to those who leave the choice with him. And there's some things in that poem I'm a bit uneasy with. I feel that it's a bit too me-centred, because we're not the centre of the universe, God is. But there's a lot of things I like about that poem. I love that illustration of God being a weaver. You know, in a tapestry, the underside looks ugly, but the front looks really nice, as long as you're a good weaver. And God is a good weaver who weaves the whole world and the whole world's story. I like the image of God working in patterns. And the idea that God works in patterns is brought out in Matthew 2 in the prophecies that are mentioned here. So after Joseph gets up and takes Jesus to Egypt, we read, "So was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son." That's quoting Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And after Herod does his wicked act, we read, what was said through the prophet Jeremiah, this is Jeremiah 31, was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And then after Joseph moves to Nazareth with Jesus, we read, so was fulfilled what he said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. So Matthew is showing us that there's a pattern of how God has worked in the past that is playing out again in the birth and the story of the life of Jesus. However, these prophecies are tricky. Here's some ways they're tricky. So the one about out of Egypt I called my son, that's actually talking about God in its original context. It's talking about God calling Israel out of Egypt when he saves them in the Exodus. How is that about Jesus? And when we come to the one about the women weeping in Ramah, Ramah is a fair journey away from Bethlehem. What does the weeping of women in Ramah have to do with the weeping of women in Bethlehem? And when we come to the Nazareth prophecy, there is no prophecy in the Old Testament that says the Messiah would be called a Nazarene. I'm not going to say more about that today, but please feel free to ask me about it next Sunday in our question time. But I'll think about the first two with you today. So as we think about what to do here, if we think about prophecy as simply this, in the Old Testament there is a prediction, in the New Testament it's fulfilled. So for example, in Matthew chapter 2 verse 6, there's a prediction in the Old Testament that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. In Matthew 2, Jesus is born in Bethlehem. Prediction, fulfilment. Or in Matthew chapter 3, it talks about a prediction in Isaiah that someone would go ahead of the Messiah to get the way ready for him. Matthew chapter 3, John the Baptist is the person who goes ahead of Jesus to get the way ready for him. So there are prophecies in the Old Testament which is a prediction that is fulfilled in the New Testament. But that's not the only way that prophecy works. That's one of the things prophecy does. But prophecy in the Old Testament also often is an alarm clock. The prophet shows up, stop sinning, stop worshipping false gods. That's not a prediction of the future. It's Israel, you're sinning, stop. Also, sometimes prophets come and say, remember the love and faithfulness of God in the past. But another thing that prophecy does is pick up on patterns that are like a tapestry throughout God's story in the world. And this is the way we should read the prophecies in Matthew chapter 2 here. They're picking up on the patterns. When they say fulfill, it's not saying here's a prediction, here's how it's fulfilled. It's saying this pattern is continuing in this part of God's story. And so it's helpful that we looked at Nehemiah recently, and a couple of times shared with you an overview of the Old Testament story. I'm going to shift that slightly so we can bring in the New Testament story, the beginning of that with Jesus, and to briefly remind you of that. So God saves his people in the Exodus, takes them through the Red Sea so they can be his people Israel. He takes them towards the promised land. On the way, he gives them his law through Moses. The law is how they are to live as his rescued people. They get to the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, and in the land they have kings. And in the time of the kings, sometimes Israel do the right thing, normally they don't. And so the prophets come and say, stop sinning. And the prophets eventually say, because you have sinned so much and so consistently, God is going to take you into exile for 70 years in the land of Babylon. And that happens. And then as God promises, after those 70 years, they come back. That's where we got to in Nehemiah, where they're back. And then hundreds of years later, Jesus is born, okay? So we got the Old Testament story. What's happening in Matthew is talking about the way God's plans work. It's showing patterns. So in Matthew 2 verse 17, out of Egypt I called my son. What it's doing is it's saying what's happening with Jesus now is similar to what happened with Israel in the Exodus. The Exodus is the greatest salvation story in the Old Testament. The life of Jesus is the greatest salvation story in the New Testament. By applying Hosea 1:11 to Jesus, Matthew is drawing a line between these two great events and saying, look how God showed up to save in the past. God is showing up to save powerfully now as well. There's one way. What about verse 18? A voice is heard in Ramah. Well, Ramah was the gathering place where the Israelites were brought before they were taken into exile. You can imagine the tears of women and others as they grieved. All of God's children are being taken out of the promised land. Lots of tears. The exile is one of the darkest moments in the Old Testament, and Herod's evil act is one of the darkest moments in the New Testament. And what seems to be happening here is it's almost like Matthew is drawing a set of bookends. Great evil in the past, great evil in the present. In a sense, Jesus' birth is going to bring an end to a spiritual exile. Matthew's definitely got the exile on his mind. If we go back to Matthew chapter 1, Matthew chapter 1 gives us a family tree of Jesus. And at the end of that he says this, there were 14 generations from Abraham to King David, 14 from King David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. The exile is crying out for salvation. And by picking up on the darkest moment in the Old Testament, one of them, and saying that Jesus is here, there's drawing brackets between that, lifting our eyes to the one who will one day wipe all tears away. What about the Nazarene prophecy? Ask me about it next Sunday. Friends, God's got a plan in the details. God's got a plan prophetically throughout history. He works in saving patterns. He has in the past, he has in Jesus. We can trust him to do that again. I want to finish. I hope I'm not breaching copyright here, but I've tweaked that Weaver poem to bring out a final comment. The world and its story is but a weaving, woven by the Lord of life. We cannot choose the colours. He works steadily. Often he weaves sorrow, as when his beloved son died, but he clearly sees the upper and we the underside. Shall God unfold the canvas and explain the reasons why? Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly. The dark threads are as needed in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver on the patterns he's planned. He will work out his purposes to bring good from evil, light from darkness, life from death. The weaver's patterns may confuse. Sometimes we feel distress. But one day all will be made clear, as with him his loved ones are blessed.